Usually today in our society, we think of, we go through our struggles and our fights in our early years, and then in our middle age, and then later on, we can kind of relax and sit back and rest on our laurels and kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, I did pretty well, didn't I? And now I can relax, and nobody will have that against me, hold that against me. I have that coming to me, my retirement, so to speak. Saint Haralambos is an example to all of us that we are called even up to the end of our life to be faithful.
I take from Saint Haralambos that you will be tested in your faith no matter what age you are. Whether you're a 1, 50, or 113 years old like Saint Haralambos, you always better be prepared, and you always better be ready to witness your faith, because just like the end days will come like a thief in the night, Christ says, you will be tested like a thief in the night. We don't know where it will come. But just as St. John the Baptist says, prepare the way of the Lord, he says we better be ready. We better be ready at all times. And that's what St. Haralambos teaches us, because in the twilight of his life, he was put to the ultimate test.
In 85 AD, the great Saint Haralambos was born in Magnesia of Asia Minor, near Smyrna. He was a humble man and lived to 113 years old.
Not much is really known about his upbringing, except the fact that he became a priest at a very young age in his hometown.
It was tremendously difficult to be a priest during these first several centuries, because you end up with a situation where the church is struggling to exist in a community which is very hostile to it. We know that it's illegal to be a Christian.
Of course, in the first 100 years of the church's history, there were no churches. There was very few ordained priests. The apostles were sending individuals out to proselytize. However, the church was under great persecution by the Romans. The church was underground. The church was in the catacombs. The communion suppers, imitating what Christ did, take ye, eat, this is my body, were done at meals, in homes, in private, in secret.
The emperors were considered gods and wanted to be worshipped, and people would offer incense to the emperor and so on. The Christians believed in praying for the emperor, but they would not worship him. And this was a big insult to the emperor.
They believed that these individuals, like Haralambos, who rose to popularity, were rising to political popularity with political aims and objectives. And of course, they viewed them as enemies of the state.
This was the reign of Septimus Severus, who began his persecution of the Christians in North Africa, went through Egypt, and finally decided that he wanted to get rid of the Christians in the Anatolia, which is basically Asia Minor today.
Severus, seeing the failed attempts of his predecessors, of the preceding emperors, in trying to stamp out Christianity with all-out persecutions, decides on another tactic. That is, we'll let you live in peace, but we will no longer permit you to baptize pagans into Christianity. Figuring, and it's rather clever, thereby slowly but surely stamping out Christianity, figuring that there wouldn't be much of an outburst against this policy. Well, now you have someone like St. Haralambos who cannot but preach, and therefore people hearing his preaching, they can't help but want to become Christian. And for that reason, this 113-year-old man is such a threat to the emperor and to the officials, the Roman officials in Magnesia of Asia Minor.
The very interesting point about St. Haralambos is that he's put to his test. He's given his cross that he has to carry. Not when he's a young man, not in middle age, but in the twilight of his life, when he's 113 years old.
In St. Haralambos' case, he was attracting that attention for being a strong old man, but he was attracting even more attention because of his faith. And to the emperor, there was a rage and a jealousy, not only because he was attracting attention as an old person, but because he was focusing that attention on Jesus Christ.
The provincial governor of the area, Lucianos, heard about the prominence of this Christian that was preaching all over and gaining so many people to Christianity, and summoned his soldiers to bring Haralambos unto him.
Haralambos was brought before Lucianos and was told to deny Christ or suffer great torture and suffer great pain. Haralambos would not deny Christ, but if anything, his voice grew even stronger in praising and glorifying the Lord.
So he tells the governor that he's not going to renounce Christ, no matter what he does.
Just the mention of Jesus Christ as a God set the governor off.
So he says, you don't want to renounce Christ? Well, I'll show you what I'm going to do. So he parades him into town in front of everybody, and he starts to torture him.
This period of suffering was commonly known as the longest period of suffering that anyone has ever suffered for the name of Christ.
When they targeted Haralambos, they knew that if they would just execute him, they would make a martyr. So it was very important for them to see if they could get Haralambos to deny his faith. And they thought that by subjecting him to pain and torture, that sooner or later he was going to relent. But they were wrong.
They stripped him of all his clothing. They put him in a public place. They whipped him. They cut him with knives, always being careful not to kill the person. They wanted him to suffer. They wanted to make him a public spectacle because they believed that this would be a deterrent to the people.
What happened was just the opposite.
When the common people saw the suffering that this saint would undergo for Christ's name, they were inspired.
The people, instead of becoming frightened, were amazed at the fortitude, at the courage of this particular priest. Mind you, that he wasn't even a young man, but an old man, where you would think that at this point in his life, he would say, you know, I want to die a peaceful death. I'll do whatever you say. I'll just stop baptizing and catechizing. And they would have agreed to that. He didn't have to necessarily worship the idols, just had to stop his Christian missionary work. And the people were amazed at this old man's fortitude.
Some would ask, why would God let a 113-year-old man suffer such great pain for his name? We have to remember, Saint Haralambos was a man who endured the suffering willfully. He wanted this suffering to take place, much like the suffering of our Lord Jesus Christ on the cross.
And they are so inspired by that they ask Haralambos to pray for them. And of course the saint immediately prays for them, and they are converted to Christianity, which drives Lucianos even more nuts and wild.
Well, since St. Haralambos survived all these tortures, the military governor is so frustrated with his commander that he said, I'll take care of it myself. So they both rushed there to inflict the tortures themselves.
The governor reached out to strike St. Haralambos, and his arm was paralyzed. He couldn't move.
And the other one goes to spit upon St. Haralambos, and his whole face becomes paralyzed.
Now you have Lucianos, the governor of Magnesia, and this official pleading to St. Haralambos to pray to his God, to this Christ, whom shortly before they were mocking and they wanted him to deny.
And as he had done with almost all of his tortures, he prayed to God to be merciful to the people who were torturing him, imitating Christ, who did the same thing on the cross. And God answered the prayer. They were all healed and back to normal.
Being freed from this, they finally realized the power of God within their hearts, and the example and witness of Haralambos softens their hearts, and they become Christians themselves.
Then the governor wrote all this down in a letter to the emperor. He described what had just happened, and then after he finished describing what happened, he also offered his resignation.
Upon receiving the letter from his great governor, the emperor was enraged.
Think of it. You have a young, virile emperor and a 113-year-old man that's in his way. So he sends 300 of his soldiers to Magnesia to bring now the saint to Antioch, where the emperor is.
So St. Haralambos appears in front of the emperor, and the emperor demands him to renounce Christ, and of course, once again, he refuses. So the emperor now begins a series of tortures. He stones him, tries to burn him, almost everything else that was done to him before.
And the emperor himself oversaw the continuing torture of Haralambos. And at one point, he became so frustrated, he began shooting arrows up in the air, trying to get at the god of Haralambos.
Looking up to the skies and the heavens and shouting and demanding, saying, I want to fight this Christ. Come down here on earth so I can fight you, do battle with you. That's what all really emperors knew how to do. They weren't even very good administrators. They had their prefects, their governors do that. They were basically military commanders. So this was it. He was going to now do battle with the god of this ancient old man.
How symbolic that someone doesn't want people to believe in Christ, and he himself is acknowledging that this guy up there, this superpower is up there fortifying this guy. So he's shooting arrows at Christ, starting a fight with Christ.
Well, if you're going to challenge Christ, you know what Christ does. Christ, all of a sudden, he opens up the sky and a storm pours out and destroys everything in the area.
The emperor's daughter, Galini, even is intimidated by this and appeals to her father, the emperor, to please put a rest to all of this.
She realized that this was the consequence of his rage and that he needed to understand what he was dealing with.
His daughter comes to him and says, you know something, if I were you, I would give in to these people. This God is more powerful than your arrows and your military and your political power.
So the emperor does not listen to her. So then she turns to St. Haralambos and begs him, please pray for us to stop this. And of course St. Haralambos does, and the storm subsides.
For 3 days, the emperor stays inside of the palace. He doesn't come out. He contemplates now what has happened to him.
You can imagine that there was probably a tug of war going on in his own heart, seeing this faith of this frail old man on one hand, but stronger than the strongest of his soldiers on the other, fighting for the Lord's army.
During those 3 days, Galini, his daughter, has a dream. And in the dream, she beholds a beautiful garden. And there is, outside of the garden, her father and Crispus. And between her father and Crispus and the garden is an angel with a fiery sword. And then she sees herself in the garden. She wakes up, she goes to St. Haralambos, approaches him, and tells him of this dream, and asks him to interpret it for her. And the saint knows immediately. And he says to her, the dream means this, that you have accepted Christ, and therefore you will be in paradise. You will receive the kingdom of heaven. He says, unfortunately though, your father, the emperor, and Crispus will not accept Christ, and therefore they will not enter into paradise, into the kingdom of heaven.
Severus was kind of reticent exactly how to deal with Haralambos. He didn't want to execute him outrightly because he would create a martyr, so he wanted either to get him to weaken in his faith or to degrade himself. So he ordered that he be sent to the home of a widow.
It was a shame to be banished to a widow's house, and at the same time, it is an attempt to shame him and to call attention to others that they might suffer a similar fate.
When he arrived at the home where he was forced to stay for the night, he leaned against the post outside of the house, and immediately the post turned into a tree and began to blossom, and green leaves and shade and all kinds of things all around it. And when she saw that, she was really taken in that this man was special.
It becomes like his pulpit. He starts to preach to this woman. The neighbors start to hear him and start to come daily to listen to the wisdom of this man, even though public opinion was supposed to humiliate him because he was living with this widow. It did the opposite.
Severus was very hesitant to execute Haralambos, but there was a regional governor in Antioch whose name was Crispus, who was much more violent and much more ambitious.
Crispus approaches the emperor and says to him, you need to have this man beheaded, and you need to stop what's happening.
Finally, Severus, after everything he had gone through and failed, decided that Crispus was right, and he gave the order for Haralambos to be beheaded.
He sends a person by the name Porphyrios and Baptist to go bring him back to torture him and behead him and get it over with.
As the two executioners raised their weapons to execute Haralambos, a voice came from heaven and said, well done, my faithful servant. Enter into the kingdom of heaven. At which point the saint died a very peaceful death before even one blow was struck upon him by the executioners.
This is one of the reasons why St. Haralambos is known as the saint who wouldn't die.
And the two executioners, Porphyrios and Baptist, after witnessing all the tortures that St. Haralambos went through, converted also to Christianity, and they were martyred on the same day.
St. Haralambos, who is commemorated, who is remembered on February 10th, the day that he died, is commemorated not by himself, but fittingly with these two people who are converted, the two executioners who couldn't do their job, who could not execute the saint. Why? Because he was such a faithful servant. And they heard the voice from heaven that recognized before all and proclaimed Saint Haralambos to be that faithful servant.
In 1943, during the German occupation of Western and Eastern Europe, in the country of Greece, there was a village in the Peloponnesus area named Philatra.
The German soldiers were trying to invade the town of Philatra because outside of Philatra, a small garrison of German soldiers were executed, were ambushed by the communists, the Andartes, the guerrillas that were in the mountains. And usually when a Greek killed a German, 50 Greeks would be killed in response to the death of one of the German soldiers.
So the order was given from the command of the Peloponnesus, which was in Tripoli, that the regional commander in Philatra should take all of the men hostage, about 1,500 men, take them off to Germany, probably to be executed, and burn down the village. So the officer's name was Kunster, and Kunster went to bed that night planning in the morning to execute the orders that had been given to him.
He was totally beside himself because he was saying, I've been very friendly not only to the village but to the surrounding areas, and this is what happens.
When the order had first been issued out of Tripoli, there were a number of people in Tripoli who were originally from Philatra, including a priest who had originally gone down to the German command to see if he could talk them out of it, but saw that it was just too charged a situation, and he backed off. But he put out the word to his patriotas, the other people from the village, that they needed to pray because their town was going to be destroyed. And they all prayed to Saint Haralambos as their protector.
So that night he's going to sleep, and he's very angry still, upset. He's going, I'm going to level this city, no matter what. And during his sleep, he has a dream. And a dream of an old man comes to him in a dream and tells him, don't do what you're going to do. I want you to stop. Because if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, you're not going to see your family again.
And he went back to sleep, and the second time the old man came to him and told him, I told you, don't do it, and don't worry about being disciplined from above. I will take care of you. And then a third time he saw the old man who told him, don't follow the orders. He finally went to sleep, and he tossed and turned all night. He had a terrible night.
He wakes up, and he's very agitated about this. Who am I seeing? He cannot understand it.
He called his commanding officer in Tripoli, and he said to him, I just had a terrible, terrible night, and I'm questioning what I should do. And his officer asked him what happened, and he said that he had seen in his sleep this man, and he described him, and he gave me directions that I should not follow the orders. The commander in Tripoli said, I had the same dream, and I'm withdrawing from you the order to destroy the city.
Later, the villagers and the leaders of the town asked the German officers, what happened? Why didn't you carry out the orders to destroy this town and to kill us all? And they said, we saw this man. So they asked, what man? This man, he had a beard, and he was, tall, and he was slender, and he was wearing black robes. A man with black robes?
Kunster went with some of the local people around to all the churches trying to find out who the old man was that he had seen in his sleep. And they went to all the churches, and finally, at the church of the Panagia, he saw an icon of Saint Haralambos, and he said, that's him. Who is this man? And they told him all about it. He prayed, he fell down on his knees, which is extremely impressive because most people from other Christian traditions don't have this idea of praying to saints or accepting this. But he was so taken in by what had happened and by the power of the experience that he had through the night that he just fell down in tears and prayed.
And he says, I will do what you told me to do. I will not level the city. Will you do for me what you said you would do for me? And eventually everyone's crying, and he gets up and he leaves the city alone, does not level it. And then after the occupation of the Nazis is released and they remove themselves and go back to Germany, he goes back and he finds his family, which is in the city outside of Dresden, which during World War II was one of the most bombed cities, where it was a firestorm. They dropped so many incendiary bombs on this city and the surrounding areas that it practically killed almost 100,000 people. in one night. And his family survived. And every year, from that time on, he would return on February 10th, which is the feast day of St. Haralambos, and walk in the procession around this whole square as they carried the icon. About 4 years ago, he stopped, and they feel that he has passed away.
And to this day, many come from all over Peloponnesus in Greece to celebrate this great happening, this great event in the history of that town, from this great saint, this great model.
Ο στήλος ακλόνητος της Εκκλησίας Χριστού και λίχνος αηφωτός της οικουμένης σοφέ εδείχθης Χαράλαμπες έλαμψας εν το κόσμο δια του μαρτυρίου έλυσας και ειδόλων την σκοτωμέναν μάκαρ δύο εν παρησία Χριστό πρέσβευε σωθήνε